The negotiated state. In the course of Pakistan's 60-year history, there have been several different attempts radically to change Pakistan by one civilian and three military regimes. Generals Ayub Khan and Pervez Musharraf military rulers in 1958 to 1969 and 1999 to 2008, respectively. Both took as their model Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the great secular modernizing nationalist and founder of the Turkish Republic. General Ziaul Haq, military ruler from 1977 to 1988, took a very different course, trying to unite and develop Pakistan through enforced adherence to a stricter and more puritanical form of Islam mixed with Pakistani nationalism. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, founder of the Pakistan People's Party and civilian ruler of Pakistan in the 1970s, for his part tried to rally the Pakistani masses behind them with a program of anti-elitist economic populism also mixed with Pakistani nationalism. And they all failed. Every single one of them found their regimes ingested by the elites they had hoped to displace and engaged in the same patronage politics as the regimes they had overthrown. None was able to found a new mass party staffed by professional politicians and ideologically committed activists rather than local feudals and urban bosses and their followers. Indeed, with the exception of Bhutto, none tried seriously to do so, and after a short while, Bhutto's PPP too had ceased to be the radical party of its early years and had become dependent on the same old clans and local patronage. The military governments which took power promising to sweep away the political elites and their corruption and also found themselves governing through them, partly because no military regime has been strong enough to govern for long without parliament, and the parliament is drawn from the same old political elites and reflects the society which the military regimes wish in principle to change. Western demands of such regimes simultaneously reform the country and restore democracy are therefore in some ways an exercise in comprehensively missing the point. To have changed all this and created a radical national movement for change like that of Ataturk would have required two things. Firstly, a strong Pakistani nationalism akin to modern Turkish nationalism, something that ethnically divided Pakistan does not have and cannot create. And secondly, a capacity for ruthlessness to equal that of Ataturk and his followers in suppressed ethnic, tribal and religious opposition. For the pleasant Western story of Turkey's ascent to its fragile democracy of today ignores both the length of time this took and the hecatomb of corpses on which the modern Turkish state was originally built. With the exception of dreadful atrocities perpetrated in East Bengal in 1971 committed against people whom the Punjabi and Pathan soldiery regarded as alien, inferior and Hindu influenced, the Pakistani state has not been able to commit abuses on a really massive scale against its own people, either because in the case of Punjab and NWFP, its soldiers were not willing to kill their own people, or in Sindh and even in Balochistan, because it always in the end had to make compromises with the local elites. One of the most striking things about Pakistan's military dictatorships is in fact how mild they have been by the historical standards of such dictatorships when it comes to suppressing dissent and criticism among the elites. Only one Prime Minister, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, and a tiny handful of politicians have ever been executed in Pakistan. Far fewer have been killed in feuds with each other. Few senior politicians have been tortured. Of course, the poor are a different matter, but as noted, they get beaten up by the police, whoever is in power. Perhaps the single most important social distinction in Pakistan is that between what Graham Greene called the torturable classes and the untorturable ones. This view has support from a surprising source, as General Musharraf writes in his memoirs, "Whatever the law, civil or military, the poor are always the victims of oppression. Nor indeed has Pakistani state ever faced rebellion in West Pakistan on a scale that would have provoked massacre in response, though that could be changed by the Taliban insurgency in Pathan areas, which began in 2004 and gathered strength in 2008 and 2009. India has faced much more serious rebellions and has engaged in much large-scale repression in response. But in India, as in Pakistan, the state is not responsible for most human rights abuses. This is something that human rights groups in particular find hard to grasp, since they stem from a modern Western experience in which oppression came chiefly from overmighty states. In Pakistan, however, as in India, the vast majority of human rights abuses come not from state strength, but from state weakness. Even when they are committed by the state policemen, they are not on the orders of the government, but are the result of individual policemen or groups of police preying on the population as their ancestors did for centuries. Take the police chief in the interior of Sindh, who told me, "I try to stop my boys raping women and torturing people to death." Beyond that, you have to be realistic. Anyway, we need to raise more money from the people just to do our job halfway properly. No one can seriously imagine that when police rape a woman or torture a suspected criminal in their custody, that this is the will of the Prime Minister Manmohan Singh of India or President Zardari of Pakistan. They can be accused of not doing enough to stop such abuses, but their ability to do so is very limited. So Pakistan, and indeed South Asia and much of Latin America, demonstrates the frequent irrelevance of democracy even in an area where we instinctively think that it makes all the difference, namely human rights. The overwhelming majority of human rights abuses in Pakistan stems from a mixture of freelance brutality and exploitation by policemen working either for themselves or for local elites, actions by local landlords and bosses, and punishments by local communities of real or perceived infringements of their moral code. The murder of women in honor killings, the giving of young girls in marriage as compensation in settlements of clan feuds, the dreadful cases of gang rape as a punishment which have taken place in recent years in southern Punjab, Sindh, Balochistan are the work of families or local clans and the collective leadership, not of the state. Atrocities by local dominant clans and the police are not entirely characteristics of much of the neighboring democratic India as regards the police. This is starkly revealed in a report by Human Rights Watch of August 2009. Not for nothing was an old Hindustani popular term for banditry, Padshahi Kam, the imperial trade. This indicated not only that ordinary people could usually see no difference between bandits and soldiers, but they often changed places. Unpaid soldiers became bandits, successful bandits became soldiers of conquering armies, and the leaders became kings. According to standard Western models, and to the Pakistani constitution that derives from them, authority stems from the sovereign people through elections and then spreads downwards from the government through hierarchical structures which transmit orders from above, from superior to inferior officials in accordance with laws made by the parliament or at least by some formal authority. In Pakistan, only the armed forces work even in the second half of this way. For the rest of the state, the law, the judiciary, and the police authority is a matter of constant negotiation with the violence or the threat of it, very often one of the cards that can be played on either side. The negotiated nature of Pakistani state was summed up for me in a grim anecdote from a retired general who in 1990s was responsible for commanding anti-dacoit operations in Sindh. A subordinate had run a dacoit gang to earth on the state of the parliamentarian from the then ruling party and wanted to send troops in to get him, which would have led to furious protests from the governments in Islamabad and Karachi, and most probably the immediate release of the men arrested. His commander overruled him and instead invited himself to lunch with the landowner concerned. At the end of a convivial meal, he passed his host a note and said that he'd be personally obliged for his help. The next day, 4 of the dacoits were handed over to the army with a message from the landowner politicians saying that the general could shoot 2 of them, but could he please charge the other 2 before the court? Any 2? I asked somewhat faintly. No, he said. Which 2 we could shoot? Probably they had offended him in the some way, or they were not from his tribe. As to the other 2, he knew perfectly well that his influence meant that the courts would never convict him and they would be released after a few months. The courts are useless when it comes to criminals in this country. If the criminals have any connection, they're bribed or scared or both. This is why if you really want to deal with a miscreant, the only way is to kill them out of hand. This is a hard country, and this is the way things are, sadly. The negotiated nature of the state also applies to the workings of democracy. For democracy is representative not only of people but also of those classes, groups, and institutions through which the popular will is refracted, until it eventually finds some kind of distorted reflection in elected institutions. In other words, democracy usually reflects not so much the people or the electorate as the distribution of social, economic, cultural, and political power within a given society. The nature of Pakistani society and the weakness of real democratic development are shown, among other things, by the lack of real, modern mass political parties with their own layers of party workers. A while spent pondering on these themes could bring out why so much Western analysis of Pakistan misses the mark, because it expects institutions with names like the law and the police to work as they are meant to work in the West, according to rules rather than negotiation. Similarly, Western language about corruption in Pakistan suggests it can and it should be carved out of political system. But insofar as the political system runs on patronage and kinship, and corruption is intertwined with patronage and kinship, to cut it out would mean gutting Pakistan society like a fish. This, of course, is precisely what the Islamist revolutionaries would like to do. The modern Islamist political groups are trying to replace the clan and patronage politics of feudal landowners and urban bosses with their own version of modern mass politics, so far with only very limited success. With the partial exception of the Jamaat-e-Islami, the Islamist political parties have themselves been swallowed up by the patronage system. As for the Pakistani Taliban, the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, or the TTP, they are so far a primitive collection of guerrilla or terrorist groups, which could be completely at sea if they found themselves responsible for Peshawar, let alone Lahore or Karachi. Of course, they do draw a great deal of the strength from the glaring inequities and oppressions of the Pakistani system, above all the justice system. It is true, as I've said, that the ordinary Pakistanis are themselves part of endless conspiracies to prevent the course of justice. But it is also true that they feel that they have no choice, given the nature of the justice system. The state's law is felt by many ordinary people not just to be rigged in favor of the rich and hopelessly slow, corrupt and inefficient, but also to be alien to local tradition, alien to Islam, the creation of alien Christian rulers, and conducted by elites for their own benefit. So, as this book will describe, when ordinary people speak of their reverence for the Sharia and their respect for the Taliban when they introduce the Sharia, they should not necessarily be taken as active support for the Taliban's complete program. Rather, it is a mixture of a reverence for the Sharia as a part of the word of God dictated by the last prophet, with a vague yearning for a justice system that might be cruder than that of the state, but would also be quicker, less biased in favor of the elites, and conducted before the eyes of the people in their own language. Mixed in with this is a great deal of somewhat veiled anti-elitist feelings, which in the eyes of the parts of Pathan tribal population helps fuel mass acceptance of Taliban attacks on the local maliks and khans or tribal bosses and local landowners. But then, the Pathans have always been the most culturally egalitarian people of Pakistan among the masses elsewhere. The progress of the Islamists have so far generally been very limited when it comes to gaining active mass support. One key reason for their failure to date is the deeply conservative nature of much of Pakistani society. For, contrary to the most Western perceptions, Islamist mobilization often thrives not on backwardness but on partially achieved modernity. Thus, to judge by all the economic evidence about poverty and land ownership, radical Islamist groups preaching land reform ought to be flourishing in Pakistani countryside. In fact, the only areas where they have any significant success outside the Pathan territories are where a sectarian Sunni versus Shia or tribal element comes into play. This is partly because of the clan solidarity, but also for the simple reason that the only people which could lead such a radical Islamist movement in the countryside are the local mullahs, and they are in effect chosen by the local feudal landowners, who do not exactly favor radicalism of any kind, least of all involving land reform. In the cities, things are freer. But even their most attempts at political mobilization from below are stifled by the grip of the political bosses and the kinship groups they lead, as well as by the politically apathetic condition of the society and by the divisions along religious lines. In other words, while there is certainly a great deal of economic social discontent in Pakistani population, being discontented is not at all the same thing as being able to do something about it. As of 2009, the perennial discontent of the urban masses in most of Pakistan continues to express itself not in terms of political mobilization behind new mass movements, but sporadic and pointless riots and destruction of property, including most notably the buses in which the writers themselves have to travel every day. According to standard Western version, by the Western way is the only way to modernity, the key ideological struggle in Pakistan is between westernized modernity, including democracy, the rule of law, and so on, and Islamic conservatism. A more accurate way of looking at it would be to see much of Pakistan as a highly conservative, archaic, and even sometimes quite inert and somnolent mass of different societies with two modernizing impulses fighting to wake it up. The Western modernizers have on their side the prestige and success of Western model in the world in general and the legacy of British rule, including a vague belief in democracy, but are crippled both by the conservative nature of Pakistani society and the growing popular hatred for the US and its Western allies. The Islamist modernizers can draw on much more ancient and deeply rooted tradition, that of Islam, but are crippled by the conservative nature of Pakistani society, by Pakistan's extreme vociferousness, by the failure of their program elsewhere in the Muslim world, and by the fact that the vast majority of Pakistani elites reject the model for cultural as well as class reasons. Both Westerners and Islamists see the battle between them as apocalyptic and even and ending with the triumph of good or evil. Yet there is a fair chance that Pakistan will, in effect, shrug both of them off, roll over and go back to sleep.